The morning sun filtered through the oak trees lining Pinecrest Boulevard, casting golden rays across the quiet upscale neighborhood. Evelyn Harper adjusted the delicate ribbon on her wide-brimmed hat as she walked hand in hand with her daughter Lily. It was their cherished Saturday tradition, morning strolls followed by a visit to the charming shops downtown. Lily, a bright-eyed 7-year-old, twirled beside her mother in her favorite lilac dress, the hem swirling playfully. Her patent leather shoes clicked softly on the sidewalk, punctuating her excitement as she pointed at the colorful storefronts they passed. "Mommy, look!" Lily's voice chimed with delight as she gestured toward a street performer playing a lively tune on a shiny saxophone. Evelyn paused, her eyes following her daughter's enthusiastic gaze. The music carried a soulful warmth, blending seamlessly with the morning air, filled with the aromas of fresh pastries and roasted coffee. "Isn't he wonderful, sweetheart?" Evelyn said, her voice soft and melodic. Lily nodded vigorously, her curls bouncing. "Can we stay and listen for a minute?" "Please?" "Of course, darling," Evelyn replied, leading her to a nearby bench shaded by an old magnolia tree. They sat together, swaying gently to the rhythm of the music, Lily's small hand resting in her mother's. Moments like these were Evelyn's favorite, precious fragments of time when the world seemed to slow down, and the bond with her daughter felt unbreakable. As the performer finished his piece, Lily clapped with unbridled enthusiasm, her laughter bubbling like a brook. The man tipped his hat in gratitude, and Evelyn slipped a few dollars into the case at his feet. "Thank you for the lovely music," she said warmly, and he nodded with a smile. Further down the boulevard, they stopped briefly at a quaint cafe. Through the open windows, Evelyn could see families enjoying the morning, a mother sharing a slice of carrot cake with her son, an elderly couple holding hands over steaming cups of tea. Lily waved at a little girl sitting by the window, and to her delight, the girl waved back shyly. "Mommy?" Lily began as they resumed their walk. "Where are we going next?" Evelyn smiled mysteriously. "There's a special surprise waiting for you, my love." Lily's eyes lit up. "A surprise? What is it? Tell me." "You'll see," Evelyn teased gently. "But I think you're going to love it." Their destination soon came into view, an elegant toy store with a polished brass sign that read, "Winslow's Toy Emporium." Lily slowed as they approached, her gaze fixed on the elaborate window display. A magnificent dollhouse stood at the center, its 3-story structure a masterpiece of craftsmanship. Painted a soft cream with intricate blue trim, the house was complete with tiny flower boxes under the windows and a miniature cobblestone path leading to a perfectly scaled porch. Evelyn watched her daughter's awe with quiet satisfaction. "Do you like it?" she asked. Lily pressed her hands to the glass, her breath fogging the pane slightly. "It's the prettiest thing I've ever seen," she whispered. "Would you like to go inside and take a closer look?" Evelyn asked, crouching to meet Lily's wide-eyed gaze. Lily nodded so vigorously that her curls bounced. "Can I? Really?" Evelyn smiled, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's face. "Absolutely. But first, let me park the car. Why don't you go ahead and start looking around? Stay close to the dollhouse and I'll join you in just a moment." Lily could hardly contain her excitement as Evelyn guided her to the store's heavy wooden door, the polished brass handle gleaming in the sunlight. "Remember, I'll be right back," Evelyn said, giving her daughter's shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "I'll wait right by the dollhouse, Mommy," Lily promised, stepping inside with a mixture of anticipation and reverence. The soft chime of the doorbell announced Lily's entrance into the store. She paused, momentarily overwhelmed by the splendor around her. The wooden floors gleamed, reflecting the sunlight streaming through the large front windows. Rows of shelves, perfectly organized, showcased an array of toys, hand-painted figurines, delicate porcelain dolls, and trains so intricate they seemed almost real. The dollhouse from the window display stood prominently near the center of the store. Up close, it was even more mesmerizing. Each shingle on the roof looked individually placed, and the tiny brass doorknobs gleamed like real gold. Through the windows, Lily could see miniature rooms with furniture so detailed it seemed impossible they had been crafted by human hands. As she approached, her fingers hovered above the dollhouse, hesitating to touch it. Her heart fluttered as she noticed even the curtains were real fabric, sewn with the finest thread. A tiny teapot rested on a dining table inside, and she could almost imagine the dolls that might live there having tea parties. "It's so perfect," Lily breathed, reaching out with the utmost care to lift one of the tiny chairs from the dollhouse's parlor. It was no larger than her thumb, yet the detail was astounding. She turned it in her small hands, marveling at its craftsmanship. Suddenly, the sharp click of heels on the wooden floor broke the tranquility of the moment. A tall woman with a rigid posture and an air of authority appeared from behind the counter. Her graying hair was neatly pulled into a bun, and her tailored suit exuded sophistication. This was Martha Winslow, the store's owner, and her eyes locked on Lily with a sharpness that made the child flinch. "What do you think you're doing?" Martha's voice was crisp and accusatory, slicing through the quiet atmosphere like a knife. Lily froze, her hands trembling slightly as she carefully replaced the chair in its rightful spot. I was just looking," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Looking?" Martha's eyes narrowed, her tone growing colder. "Children don't come into my store just to look. I know your kind. Sticky fingers, quick to pocket anything you can get your hands on." Lily's face burned with embarrassment and confusion. "But I wasn't—" "Enough," Martha snapped, cutting her off. "Don't try to deny it. I've dealt with enough troublemakers to know better." She stepped closer, her shadow falling over Lily like an ominous cloud. Martha's voice grew louder, sharp enough to make the other patrons in the store turn their heads. "You come in here, touching things you can't afford, thinking you can get away with it. Not in my store." Tears welled in Lily's eyes as her chest tightened with a mix of fear and shame. She shook her head, her curls bouncing. "I didn't take anything. I was just looking at the dollhouse," she whispered. Martha scoffed, her manicured fingers gripping Lily's small arm. The grasp was firm, not enough to hurt, but enough to make Lily gasp in alarm. "We'll see about that," Martha said coldly, dragging Lily toward the front door. The store fell into an uncomfortable silence. Customers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to intervene. A young woman near the counter fidgeted with her purse, clearly torn, while an older man frowned deeply but stayed rooted in place. "Out!" Martha barked, pushing the door open with one hand and leading Lily onto the bustling sidewalk. The mid-morning sunshine, which had felt so warm and inviting earlier, now seemed harsh and exposing as Lily was thrust into the middle of the busy street. Several pedestrians paused, their attention caught by the scene unfolding before them. A group of young mothers stopped mid-conversation, their strollers forming a semicircle as they watched. A man in a suit slowed his pace, his briefcase swinging at his side. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Martha's voice rang out, loud and piercing. "This child thought she could steal from my store," she announced, her tone laced with disdain. Parents these days letting their children run wild with no discipline. Lily's small frame trembled as the tears she had been holding back spilled over. "I wasn't stealing," she managed to choke out, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to look." The crowd began to shift uneasily. Some people turned their heads away, unwilling to witness a child's humiliation, while others leaned in, their curiosity overpowering their discomfort. One woman, dressed in a chic pantsuit, whispered to her companion, "This feels wrong. She's just a little girl." The companion hesitated, glancing at Martha's rigid posture and the tears streaming down Lily's cheeks. "Maybe someone should—" Before she could finish, Lily wrenched her arm free from Martha's grasp. The tiny chair she had held earlier slipped from her hands and clattered onto the pavement. Without looking back, Lily turned and bolted, her patent leather shoes echoing against the concrete as she weaved through the growing crowd. Dominic Harper was adjusting his rearview mirror when he saw his daughter running toward him. His heart sank at the sight of her tear-streaked face, her small hands clutching the hem of her dress as she sobbed. "Lily," he called out, stepping quickly from his car and moving to meet her. She practically flew into his arms, burying her face against his chest as her small frame heaved with uncontrollable sobs. Dominic knelt down, holding her close, his protective arms forming a barrier against the world. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. For several moments, Lily couldn't speak. She clung to him as if he were her anchor in a sea of chaos. Finally, between hiccuping sobs, she managed to choke out, The lady in the store. She said I was stealing." Dominic's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. He continued to stroke her back gently. "You didn't do anything wrong, Lily. I know you wouldn't," he said firmly. "What else happened?" "She grabbed my arm and took me outside," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "Everyone was staring. It was so scary, Daddy." A slow, controlled anger burned beneath Dominic's calm exterior. He looked up at the elegant storefront just down the block, its brass sign gleaming in the sunlight like a mocking beacon. "I believe you, Lily," he said, his voice low but resolute. "And I'm going to make this right." He kissed the top of her head, then stood, guiding her to the car. Opening the passenger door, he helped her into her seat, buckling her in with deliberate care. "I want you to wait here, sweetheart," he instructed, brushing her curls gently. "Lock the doors and stay put. I'll be right back." Lily nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of lingering fear and trust in her father's unwavering presence. As the door clicked shut, Dominic straightened his posture and turned toward the toy store, his stride purposeful and unyielding. Inside Winslow's Toy Emporium, Martha was returning to the counter, her heels clicking sharply against the wooden floor. Her face was flushed from the confrontation, but she pushed aside any doubts, convincing herself she had acted appropriately. After all, rules were rules. The soft chime of the bell above the door startled her. She turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered man step inside. His presence was calm, yet commanding, his dark eyes scanning the room until they landed on her. Dominic approached the counter with measured steps, his polished shoes making a quiet rhythm against the floor. He stopped just short of the counter, his posture relaxed, but his gaze intense. "Are you the owner?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of authority. Martha straightened, smoothing her blouse instinctively. "Yes, I am," she replied, her tone clipped. "Martha Winslow. How can I help you?" Dominic's expression remained unreadable as he replied, "I'm here about my daughter, Lily Harper." "The little girl you just accused of stealing." Martha's lips tightened into a thin line. "Ah, yes. Your daughter was touching merchandise she clearly couldn't afford. I've seen it before, children coming in alone, thinking they can take what doesn't belong to them." Dominic's eyes narrowed slightly, his calm demeanor unwavering. "My daughter wasn't stealing," he said evenly. "She was admiring a dollhouse, something you should encourage in children who enter your store, not humiliate them for." Martha stiffened, her hands clasping tightly in front of her. "Sir, I have policies in place to protect my inventory." "You have a responsibility to treat your customers, especially children, with respect," Dominic interrupted, his voice firm but not raised. "Instead, you publicly shamed my daughter and made her feel unsafe. That's unacceptable." Martha opened her mouth to respond, but Dominic continued, his tone hardening. "Do you know who I am, Mrs. Winslow?" She blinked, caught off guard by the question. "No. Should I?" Dominic's gaze never wavered. "I'm the owner of this building, the leaseholder of this store. Starting today, we're going to have a conversation about what it means to serve this community." Martha's carefully constructed composure faltered as Dominic's words registered. Her eyes widened slightly and her hands gripped the edge of the counter for support. You own this building?" she asked, her voice losing its sharpness. Dominic nodded slowly, his presence towering in both stature and conviction. "I do. And as the owner, I have the authority to make changes when I see that my tenants fail to uphold the values of this community." Martha's lips parted as if to protest, but no words came out. She was accustomed to wielding control in her store, but now, faced with the realization that Dominic held far more power than she did, her confidence wavered. "You don't understand," she began weakly. "I have to protect my business." "No," Dominic interrupted, his voice cutting through her excuses like a blade. "What you have to do is treat people with decency and dignity. My daughter is 7 years old. She came into your store full of wonder and excitement, and you turned that joy into fear and humiliation. That's not protecting your business. That's damaging the very people who make it possible." The few customers lingering in the store exchanged glances, their quiet murmurs filling the space. Dominic allowed the weight of his words to hang in the air before continuing, his tone softening but remaining firm. "I'm going to give you a choice, Mrs. Winslow," he said. "You can keep running this store, but it won't be on your terms anymore. From now on, you'll be required to participate in a community outreach program. That means hosting monthly events for families, giving back to the children who visit your store, and fostering an environment of kindness and inclusion." Or? He let the alternative linger, unspoken but unmistakable. Martha's face paled. "You can't just force me to—" "I absolutely can," Dominic replied evenly. "And I will." For a long moment, Martha said nothing. Her hands trembled slightly as she stared at the man in front of her, realizing she had no leverage. Finally, she exhaled shakily, her shoulders slumping. "Fine," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll comply." Dominic's gaze remained steady. "Good. I'll have the paperwork sent over tomorrow. I suggest you start preparing for the first event." Without another word, Dominic turned and walked toward the exit, his movements calm and purposeful. The bell above the door chimed softly as he left, leaving Martha standing alone behind the counter, her world suddenly feeling far less secure. The following week, Dominic sat in his home office, the late afternoon sun casting golden hues across the room. Stacks of papers covered his desk, each one detailing plans for the upcoming community outreach events. He had enlisted the help of local organizations, including the neighborhood library and several high school volunteer groups, to ensure the initiative would be a success. Chloe sat nearby, coloring quietly at the dining table. She glanced up occasionally, her expression lighter than it had been in days. Though the sting of her experience at the toy store still lingered, she had found comfort in the way her father had stood up for her, and for others like her. "Daddy?" she said suddenly, her voice tentative but curious. "Will Mrs. Winslow really change?" Dominic looked up from his work, his face thoughtful. "I hope so, sweetheart," he replied. "Sometimes people just need a push in the right direction to see what really matters." Chloe considered this for a moment before nodding. "Do you think the other kids will like the events?" "I think they'll love them," Dominic said with a smile. "And you can help make them special. Would you like to help me plan the first story time?" Chloe's eyes brightened. "Yes." "Can we read The Little House? It's my favorite." "That's a wonderful idea," Dominic agreed. "We'll make it the centerpiece of the day." The first event at Winslow's Toy Emporium drew an impressive crowd. Children and parents filled the store, their laughter and chatter creating a lively atmosphere. Martha stood near the entrance, greeting each family with a polite smile. Though her demeanor remained reserved, there was a noticeable shift in her attitude. She no longer carried the air of superiority that had once defined her. Chloe sat in a circle of children near the dollhouse, reading aloud from her favorite book. Her voice was clear and confident, and the other children listened intently, their faces alight with wonder. Dominic watched from the back of the store, his heart swelling with pride. As the event continued, Dominic approached Martha, who was helping a young boy pick out a toy. She looked up as he neared, her expression uncertain. "I wanted to thank you for following through with this," Dominic said, his tone sincere but firm. "It's a good start." Martha hesitated before replying, her voice quieter than usual. "I didn't realize how much I was missing before. Seeing the children's faces today, it's eye-opening. Dominic nodded. Change is never easy, but it's worth it. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, filling the store with a warm glow, it was clear that this was more than just an event. It was a turning point. For Chloe, for the community, and perhaps even for Martha. Dominic Johnson spent the early evening at his desk, surrounded by stacks of papers and color-coded notes. His pen moved steadily across a checklist as he fine-tuned the final details for the community event at the toy store. Each item on the list carried weight, from arranging seating for the storytelling circle to ensuring there were enough toys for every child attending. The task was not just about logistics, it was about creating an experience that would heal and inspire. The soft hum of the printer filled the room as Dominic printed the event flyer he had carefully designed. The bright colors and cheerful fonts brought a smile to his face as he read the headline, "Stories, Smiles, and Sharing for All." Beneath the title were illustrations of children of different backgrounds, each one holding a toy or book. It was an image of inclusion and hope, a stark contrast to the incident that had inspired it. Dominic placed the first flyer prominently on the kitchen counter, propping it up against a vase of sunflowers. When Chloe came downstairs for dinner, it would be the first thing she'd see. He hoped the cheerful design would spark excitement in her and help her see the event as an opportunity to move forward. In the Whitaker family's grand townhouse, 10-year-old Sophie Whitaker sat curled up in her favorite window seat, a well-loved book of fairy tales resting on her lap. The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows, casting a warm glow across the room. Sophie traced the embossed title on the book's cover with her finger, but her attention was divided. From the adjoining room came the sharp, clipped tones of her mother's voice. Even with the door closed, Margaret Whitaker's words carried through the quiet house. Sophie listened uneasily as her mother paced back and forth, her heels clicking against the polished hardwood floor. "Who does he think he is? The audacity!" Mrs. Whitaker's voice rose, each syllable laced with indignation. "Does he really think he can dictate how I run my store?" Sophie tightened her grip on the book, sinking deeper into the cushioned window seat. She longed to escape into the world of magical kingdoms and brave heroines, but her mother's frustration was impossible to ignore. In her private study, Margaret Whitaker stood before her mahogany desk, clutching the formal letter Dominic had left. The carefully worded demands were clear: regular community events, toy giveaways, and a personal commitment to engage with the children she had once dismissed. To Margaret, the requirements felt like an intrusion, a challenge to her authority. Her reflection in the gilded mirror above the desk caught her eye. The proud, composed woman she usually saw seemed a little less confident today. Margaret set the letter down and paced the room, muttering under her breath. "I should call Richard," she mused aloud, thinking of her lawyer. But even as she considered it, the idea soured. A legal battle would draw attention she couldn't afford. Her thoughts drifted to the hidden ledgers locked in the office safe, the ones that told a very different story than the sanitized versions she presented to the world. The discrepancies in the store's finances were not mistakes, but calculated decisions she had made to maintain her lifestyle. The late Mr. Henderson's generous investment in the store had been quietly rerouted into her personal accounts after his passing, a fact that could not withstand scrutiny. Margaret sank into her leather chair, pressing her fingers to her temples. Perhaps she could feign cooperation, comply just enough to appease Dominic while finding a way to protect herself. Yes, that might work. Play along for now, keep things quiet, and regain control later. Later that afternoon, Sophie wandered outside, her book tucked under her arm. She often found solace in the alley behind the toy store, where the hum of the city felt distant and muted. The back entrance, with its chipped paint and worn steps, seemed far more authentic than the polished facade her mother meticulously maintained. As Sophie walked, a movement caught her attention. A girl about her age was passing by, carrying a stack of colorful papers. The girl's curls framed her face, and her bright eyes were kind but carried a hint of sadness. Sophie recognized her instantly. It was Chloe Johnson, the girl from the store. Chloe paused when she noticed Sophie, offering a small, tentative wave. Sophie hesitated, then lifted her hand in return, a shy smile tugging at her lips. Though no words were exchanged, something about the moment felt significant. Sophie watched Chloe disappear down the street, the encounter lingering in her mind. There was a warmth in Chloe's gesture that stood in stark contrast to the cold, tense atmosphere at home. Sophie clutched her book closer to her chest, wondering about the girl who seemed both strong and vulnerable at the same time. On a crisp Tuesday morning, Dominic's sedan pulled up to the Sunshine Children's Shelter, a modest building with colorful murals depicting scenes of joy and imagination. The laughter of children playing on the backyard swings drifted through the air, lifting his spirits as he stepped out of the car. Inside, Ms. Angela Foster, the shelter's coordinator, greeted Dominic warmly. Her office was a reflection of her work, cluttered but welcoming, with children's artwork adorning the walls and a jar of candy on her desk. "Mr. Johnson, it's wonderful to finally meet you," she said, gesturing for him to sit. "We've heard great things about your work in the community." Dominic settled into the chair and began explaining the vision for the upcoming event. As he described the storytelling sessions, the toy-sharing activities, and the overall goal of creating a space where every child felt valued, Ms. Foster's face lit up. "This is exactly what our children need," she said, leaning forward. "Many of them have never experienced the simple joy of walking into a toy store and feeling like they belong. What you're doing is incredible." At Lincoln Elementary School, Chloe sat alone on a wooden bench during recess. The playground buzzed with chatter about the event at the toy store. Groups of children excitedly discussed which toys they hoped to see and what games might be planned. Chloe pulled her jacket tighter around herself, the warm weather doing little to ease the knot of anxiety in her chest. The memory of Mrs. Whitaker's harsh accusations still lingered, making her cheeks burn with shame. She watched her classmates from a distance, feeling disconnected from their enthusiasm. "Hey, Chloe!" Jasmine Lee's cheerful voice broke through her thoughts. Jasmine, always full of energy, approached carrying a bright yellow jump rope. "Why do you look so serious?" Jasmine asked, plopping down beside her. "Haven't you heard about the toy store event? It's going to be so cool." Chloe managed a small smile. "Yeah, I heard." Jasmine tilted her head, studying her friend's expression. "Are you excited?" Chloe hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. "I guess so." The bell rang before Jasmine could press further, and the girls headed back inside. Chloe was grateful for the interruption, unsure how to explain the mix of hope and apprehension that filled her heart. That evening, Dominic's home became a hub of activity. His living room transformed into an impromptu planning space as community leaders gathered to finalize details for the event. Around the coffee table sat Rafael Mendoza, the director of the local community center, Elena Brooks, a neighborhood volunteer with a talent for organization, and Angela Foster, the shelter coordinator. "We need to make sure every child feels welcome," Rafael emphasized, his voice calm but firm. He tapped a finger on the map Dominic had laid out on the table. "This isn't just a one-time event. It's about planting seeds for something bigger." Elena nodded, jotting down notes in a notebook. "We could start with a storytelling circle to break the ice. Something interactive and fun." "Name tags are a must," Angela chimed in. "When kids hear their names, it makes them feel seen. I can bring supplies for that." Dominic listened intently, his gaze occasionally drifting to the family photo on the mantel. Chloe's smiling face reminded him of why this work mattered so deeply. "I agree," he said, leaning forward. "But Mrs. Whitaker also needs to be actively involved. This isn't just about us fixing things for her. She needs to engage with these children, see them as individuals, not as nuisances." The group murmured their agreement, though a shadow of doubt crossed Angela's face. "Do you think she'll go along with it?" she asked hesitantly. "She will," Dominic said with quiet determination. "She doesn't have a choice. Not if she wants to keep her store." Across town, in the back office of Winslow's Toy Emporium, Margaret Whitaker sat stiffly at her desk. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a desk lamp that cast harsh shadows across the walls. She stared at the manila folder Dominic had left earlier, its contents spreading like a dark cloud over her thoughts. She picked up the papers again, her manicured nails tapping against the edge of the desk. The schedule was meticulously detailed, outlining everything from the arrival of shelter children to her role in the storytelling sessions. Her name was prominently listed as the event's co-host, a fact that made her stomach twist. The door opened, and Mr. Lionel Pierce stepped inside, his crisp suit and briefcase as polished as ever. Margaret greeted him with a strained smile, gesturing for him to sit. "I need a solution, Lionel," she said without preamble, sliding the ledgers across the desk toward him. "Dominic Johnson is digging into my finances. If he finds anything irregular, I'll lose everything." Mr. Pierce adjusted his glasses and began flipping through the pages, his expression unreadable. "There are some discrepancies here," he said, his tone neutral. "But with the right adjustments, they can be explained as accounting errors. It'll take some time and money, but it's manageable." Margaret exhaled, though the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. "Do it," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'll pay whatever it takes." Lionel nodded, gathering the documents and tucking them into his briefcase. "I'll start immediately," he said, "but I advise caution. If Johnson is as thorough as you say, he might still uncover something." As he left, Margaret leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting to the stack of colorful flyers on her desk. The cheerful fonts and bright illustrations felt like a mockery of her predicament. She picked one up and crumpled it in her hand, throwing it into the wastebasket with a frustrated sigh. The following afternoon, Chloe sat on the school steps, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. She had been working on a new drawing, a whimsical scene of a dollhouse surrounded by children laughing and playing. She glanced up as Sophie Whitaker approached, clutching her own book to her chest. "Hi," Chloe said softly, a small smile tugging at her lips. Sophie hesitated, then sat down beside her. "Hi," she replied. Her gaze fell on Chloe's drawing, and her eyes lit up with curiosity. "Did you draw that?" Chloe nodded. "It's just an idea I had for the event. I wanted to show kids of all kinds playing together." Sophie studied the drawing for a long moment. "It's really nice," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. "I like how everyone looks happy." Chloe's smile widened. "Thanks. Do you like drawing too?" "I like reading more," Sophie admitted, holding up her book. "But my mom says I should focus on things that are practical." Chloe frowned slightly but didn't press further. Instead, she turned the conversation to stories, sharing her favorite books and asking about Sophie's. The two girls talked until the bell rang, their connection growing with each passing moment. That evening, Dominic sat in his study, poring over the toy store's financial records. The inconsistencies were glaring: inflated expenses, unaccounted funds, and vague amendments to the lease agreement. He jotted down notes, his pen moving with purpose. "This doesn't add up," he muttered, flipping through another page. His business experience told him these weren't simple mistakes, they were deliberate. Dominic leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The evidence was damning, but the timing was delicate. The community event was meant to heal wounds, not create new ones. If he confronted Margaret publicly, it could derail everything. Yet, if he stayed silent, her dishonesty might continue to harm others. He sighed, reaching for his phone. After a brief pause, he began drafting an email to his legal advisor, outlining the situation and seeking guidance on the best course of action. In the Whitaker household, Sophie sat on the floor of her bedroom, her knees tucked to her chest. Her mother's sharp words from earlier echoed in her mind, filling the room with an invisible weight. She glanced at her desk, where Chloe's drawing sat propped against a stack of books. Sophie had asked to take it home, and Chloe had happily agreed. The image of children playing together seemed to radiate hope, a stark contrast to the tension that filled her home. Quietly, Sophie stood and slipped out of her room. She padded down the hallway to her mother's study, the soft sound of her socks against the hardwood barely audible. The door was ajar, and she peeked inside. Margaret sat at her desk, her head in her hands. The strong, composed woman Sophie had always known seemed smaller somehow, weighed down by unseen burdens. Sophie wanted to say something, to ask about the secrets that seemed to surround their family, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she retreated to her room, clutching Chloe's drawing like a talisman. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that things might change. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Dominic Johnson's study as he stared at the evidence spread across his desk. The lease agreements and financial records he had reviewed the previous night painted a troubling picture of Mrs. Whitaker's management. Every figure he highlighted added weight to the already precarious situation. Dominic sighed deeply, running a hand through his hair. A part of him wanted to confront Mrs. Whitaker immediately, but he knew patience was key. If he exposed her now, it could unravel the progress being made with the community event. He couldn't afford to let her poor choices overshadow the larger goal of building trust and unity. Instead, Dominic drafted a carefully worded letter. It was firm, but gave Mrs. Whitaker one last opportunity to come clean before he escalated the matter. His tone was direct. Acknowledge the discrepancies and work toward restitution, or face the consequences of a full investigation. Once the letter was sealed in an envelope, Dominic slipped it into his briefcase. He glanced at the clock and realized it was almost time to meet with the planning committee. There was still much to prepare for the event, and his focus needed to shift to ensuring its success. At the community center, the planning committee buzzed with energy. Rafael Mendoza stood at the head of the table, reviewing a list of tasks while Angela Foster handed out name tags. Elena Brooks sorted through a stack of children's books, setting aside titles that celebrated diversity and inclusion. "We'll set up the storytelling circle near the front of the store," Rafael suggested, tapping the floor plan with his pen. "It'll be the first thing families see when they arrive." Angela nodded. "I can bring some cushions and rugs to make it cozy. We want the kids to feel comfortable." Elena flipped through her notebook. "What about snacks? We don't want crumbs near the toys, but we could have a refreshment table outside." "Good idea," Dominic said as he joined the group. He placed his briefcase on the table and opened it to reveal the event schedule. "I've also arranged for a local baker to donate cookies and juice boxes. They'll deliver them Saturday morning." As the committee finalized the plans, Dominic's thoughts briefly drifted to Chloe. She had been quiet lately, her usual excitement dimmed by lingering doubts about the event. He hoped that seeing the community come together would reassure her that change was possible, even in the face of past pain. In the dimly lit office of Winslow's Toy Emporium, Margaret Whitaker sat stiffly behind her desk, rereading Dominic's latest letter. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the paper down. The ultimatum was clear: cooperate fully or risk exposure. Margaret's mind raced as she considered her options. On the surface, the choice seemed simple: comply and save face. But the deeper truth was far more complicated. If Dominic or anyone else discovered the full extent of her financial misconduct, it would ruin her reputation and potentially lead to legal consequences. She glanced at the doctored ledgers Lionel Pierce had prepared, their neat columns and plausible explanations providing a fragile sense of security. But Margaret knew they wouldn't withstand intense scrutiny. "I need a way out," she muttered, pacing the room. Her eyes fell on the colorful event flyer pinned to the bulletin board. For a moment, she considered sabotaging the event, causing some kind of disruption that would shift attention away from her. But even as the thought formed, she dismissed it. The potential backlash would be too great. Margaret sat back down and buried her face in her hands. The walls of her office seemed to close in around her, the weight of her secrets pressing down harder than ever. At school, Chloe spotted Sophie sitting alone near the fence during recess, her book balanced on her knees. Chloe hesitated, then walked over and sat beside her. "Hi," Chloe said softly. "What are you reading today?" Sophie smiled faintly and held up the book. "It's a story about a girl who turns an abandoned garden into something beautiful." Chloe's eyes lit up. "That sounds amazing. I love stories like that, where something broken gets fixed and becomes better than before. Sophie nodded but didn't say anything. She closed her book and stared at the ground, her expression thoughtful. "Are you okay?" Chloe asked gently. Sophie hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Do you ever feel like your family has secrets? Things they don't want anyone to know?" Chloe blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I think everyone has secrets," she said carefully, "but sometimes keeping them makes things worse." Sophie looked up, her eyes searching Chloe's face. What if the truth hurts people? Chloe thought about her own experiences and the pain of being wrongly accused. The truth can be scary, she admitted, but it can also set people free. Dominic arrived at the toy store early Friday morning, a box of supplies in hand. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped inside. The store was quiet, the shelves neatly arranged and the air smelling faintly of cedar and lavender. Margaret was behind the counter, her posture rigid as she sorted through receipts. She glanced up when Dominic entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitaker," Dominic said, setting the box on the counter. "I wanted to drop off the final materials for tomorrow's event." Margaret nodded curtly, avoiding his gaze. "Everything is ready on my end," she said, her voice strained. "Good," Dominic replied, his tone neutral. He hesitated, then added, "I also left you a letter yesterday. I trust you've had time to read it." Margaret's hand froze mid-motion, and her eyes flicked to the crumpled envelope on her desk. "I've read it," she said tightly. Dominic leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "This is your opportunity to make things right, Mrs. Whitaker. Don't waste it." Without waiting for a response, he turned and left, the bell chiming softly behind him. Margaret stared after him, her hands gripping the counter until her knuckles turned white. That evening, Sophie found her mother sitting in the living room, staring blankly at an untouched cup of tea. The tension in the air was palpable, and Sophie hesitated before speaking. "Mom?" she said softly. "Are you okay?" Margaret glanced up, her expression guarded. "I'm fine, Sophie. Why do you ask?" Sophie fidgeted with the hem of her sweater. "You just seem worried. Is it about the event tomorrow?" Margaret sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "It's nothing you need to worry about, sweetheart. Everything will be fine." But Sophie wasn't convinced. She watched her mother for a moment longer, then quietly excused herself. Upstairs in her room, she sat by the window and stared out at the street below. A faint sense of unease settled over her, and she clutched her book tightly, as if it could shield her from the storm brewing in her family. The neighborhood buzzed with anticipation as the day of the event finally arrived. Colorful balloons and banners adorned the storefront, and families began to gather outside, their excitement palpable. Dominic stood near the entrance, greeting attendees with a warm smile as they arrived. Inside, the store had been transformed. Cozy reading corners with cushions and rugs dotted the space, while tables were arranged for the toy-sharing activities. Volunteers moved efficiently, ensuring everything was in place. Margaret stood behind the counter, her expression carefully neutral. She greeted customers politely but avoided Dominic's gaze. The weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her carefully constructed facade was on the verge of collapsing. As the clock struck 10 a.m., the doors officially opened, and the first wave of families entered. Laughter and chatter filled the air as children explored the store, their faces lighting up with wonder. Margaret watched from a distance, her heart pounding. She knew the day would test her in ways she wasn't prepared for. What she didn't yet realize was that it would also bring moments of unexpected grace. The toy store buzzed with energy as the event got underway. Children moved excitedly from station to station, their laughter echoing through the aisles. At the storytelling corner, Chloe sat cross-legged on a soft cushion, her voice clear and bright as she read aloud to a group of younger children. Her confidence grew with each word, her initial hesitance melting away in the warmth of the moment. Nearby, Angela Foster helped a group of volunteers distribute name tags, her cheerful demeanor putting parents and kids alike at ease. The refreshment table, set up just outside the store, quickly became a popular spot as families mingled and exchanged smiles. Dominic stood by the entrance, his sharp eyes scanning the room to ensure everything ran smoothly. Though he maintained a calm exterior, his mind churned with thoughts of Mrs. Whitaker. She stood behind the counter, her hands folded tightly in front of her. While she greeted families with polite nods, her stiffness betrayed her discomfort. "Mr. Johnson, everything looks wonderful," Angela said as she approached. "The kids are having a blast." Dominic smiled. "That's what we were hoping for. Thank you for all your help, Angela. We couldn't have done this without you." Angela glanced toward Mrs. Whitaker, lowering her voice. "Do you think she'll participate? She hasn't moved from that spot." "She will," Dominic replied firmly. "This event isn't just about the kids. It's about showing her what community really looks like." Margaret watched the scene unfold with a tightness in her chest. The laughter of the children and the warmth of the families felt foreign to her, almost intrusive. She was used to order, precision, and control, and the joyful chaos of the event unsettled her. A little boy approached the counter, clutching a handmade wooden car. "Is this for me?" he asked, his wide eyes filled with wonder. Margaret hesitated. "Yes," she said finally, her voice softer than usual. "It's yours." The boy's face lit up, and he ran back to his parents, holding the toy aloft like a treasure. Margaret watched him go, a strange pang in her chest. She turned her gaze to the storytelling corner, where Chloe's clear voice carried across the room. For a moment, Margaret thought of Sophie, who had always loved stories but had grown quieter in recent months. Her thoughts were interrupted by Dominic's approach. He stopped in front of the counter, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said evenly, "we'd like you to join the storytelling circle. It's important that the children see you engaging with them." Margaret stiffened. "I'm not sure that's a good idea." "It's not optional," Dominic replied, his tone firm but not unkind. "This is your opportunity to connect with the community and to show that you care." Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but the look in Dominic's eyes silenced her. With a small nod, she stepped out from behind the counter and made her way toward the storytelling corner. As Margaret approached the group, Chloe looked up and offered her a shy smile. "Would you like to read the next story?" Chloe asked, holding out a colorful picture book. Margaret hesitated, her gaze flicking between Chloe and the expectant faces of the children. Finally, she took the book and sat down on the cushion Chloe had vacated. The book felt unfamiliar in her hands, its cheerful illustrations a stark contrast to the polished, distant world she usually inhabited. Clearing her throat, Margaret began to read. Her voice was stiff at first, but as the story unfolded, she found a rhythm. The children leaned in, their wide eyes focused on her as she brought the characters to life. For the first time in years, Margaret felt a connection, not just with the story, but with the children around her. When she finished, the group erupted into applause. Margaret blinked, caught off guard by their enthusiasm. Chloe stepped forward and handed her another book. "You're really good at this," she said softly. "Will you read another?" Margaret hesitated, then nodded. She opened the second book, her voice steadier this time. As she read, Sophie entered the store and paused by the door, watching her mother with a mixture of surprise and pride. As the event continued, Margaret found herself interacting with the children more naturally. She guided a young girl through a toy demonstration, showing her how to wind up a mechanical bird. She listened as a little boy proudly recounted a story he had written at school. With each interaction, the walls Margaret had built around herself began to crumble. Sophie joined the storytelling circle, sitting quietly beside Chloe. The two girls exchanged smiles, their bond growing stronger with each shared moment. Sophie leaned over and whispered, "I've never seen my mom like this before." "She's trying," Chloe replied. "That's a good start." As the event wound down, Dominic approached Margaret in the back office. She was tidying up the ledgers on her desk, her expression guarded. "Mrs. Whitaker," Dominic began, closing the door behind him. Today was a success, but there's still the matter of the financial discrepancies. Margaret stiffened, her hands tightening on the edge of the desk. I told you, everything is accounted for. Dominic placed a folder on the desk. These documents say otherwise. You've misappropriated funds, and we both know it. Margaret's face paled, but she remained silent. You have a choice, Dominic continued. You can come clean and work toward making amends, or I can take this to the authorities. The decision is yours. Margaret's shoulders slumped. For a long moment, she stared at the folder, her mind racing. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. What would you have me do? Start by admitting the truth, Dominic said. Then we'll figure out how to make things right. The event ended with a round of applause as the final families left the store. Margaret stood by the door, thanking each person as they departed. Her usual stiff demeanor had softened, and there was a hint of warmth in her voice. Sophie walked beside her, holding her hand. You were amazing today, Mom, she said quietly. Margaret looked down at her daughter, a faint smile playing on her lips. Thank you, Sophie. That means more than you know. Across the street, Dominic watched the scene unfold. Angela Foster joined him, her expression thoughtful. Do you think she'll follow through? Angela asked. She's taken the first step, Dominic replied. The rest is up to her. As the sun set over the neighborhood, the toy store stood as a symbol of transformation. Inside, Margaret sat with Sophie in the storytelling corner, the two of them reading quietly together. For the first time in years, the store felt less like a business and more like a place of belonging. Dominic drove home with Chloe, the two of them sitting in comfortable silence. When they arrived, Chloe turned to him and said, You were right, Daddy. Kindness really does make a difference. Dominic smiled, his heart full. It's just the beginning, sweetheart. Just the beginning. The morning sun cast long golden rays across the neighborhood as Chloe Johnson carefully smoothed out the folds of her lavender dress. Her hair was neatly braided, tied with ribbons that matched the pastel shade of her outfit. Standing in front of the hallway mirror, she adjusted the small purse slung over her shoulder. It held a folded flyer for the event at the toy store, a symbol of how much today meant to her and her father. At the breakfast table, Dominic Johnson poured himself a fresh cup of coffee, his eyes following Chloe as she sat down. Her movements were precise, almost rehearsed, as though she were mentally preparing for the day ahead. Dominic smiled warmly. Nervous? He asked gently, setting his coffee mug down and resting a steady hand on her shoulder. Chloe nodded, her gaze dropping to her lap. A little, she admitted. But I want to help make it special, for everyone. That's my girl, Dominic said, his voice filled with pride. You've got this, sweetheart. Just be yourself, and everything will fall into place. Chloe nodded again, her resolve hardening. Though nervous butterflies danced in her stomach, she sat up straighter, determined to do her part. Inside Winslow's Toy Emporium, Margaret Whittaker moved from shelf to shelf with purposeful strides, her heels clicking softly against the polished hardwood floor. The light streaming through the large windows gave the space an almost magical quality, casting shimmering reflections on the glass display cases. Despite the store's charm, Margaret felt a persistent knot of anxiety in her chest. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted rows of small toys on the activity tables. She double-checked the stacks of picture books she had arranged for the reading circle, making minute adjustments to their alignment. No matter how much she tried to distract herself with these tasks, her thoughts kept circling back to the community she would soon face. People she had wronged, knowingly or not. Sophie Whittaker appeared quietly in the doorway, her presence so understated that Margaret startled slightly when she noticed her. Sophie held a book close to her chest, her long hair cascading over her shoulder. I hope everyone has fun today, Sophie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret attempted a smile but couldn't quite meet her daughter's eyes. I hope so too, she replied, turning back to her meticulous arrangements. Sophie lingered for a moment before stepping into the room. Her calm demeanor was a steadying force, even if Margaret was too preoccupied to notice. Outside the store, the sidewalk buzzed with life as families began to gather. Brightly colored banners fluttered in the breeze, announcing Community Day in cheerful, oversized letters. Children clutched the hands of their parents, pointing excitedly at the displays in the window. Dominic Johnson stood near the entrance, his polished shoes glinting in the sunlight. The flyer in his hand matched the ones scattered around the neighborhood, promising a day of stories, toys, and shared joy. He took a deep breath and stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. Margaret straightened instinctively as their eyes met. The tension between them was palpable, though both maintained their composure. They exchanged curt nods, acknowledging the unspoken weight of the day. "The children will be arriving soon," Dominic said evenly. "From the shelter, the community center, and the neighborhood." His tone carried the weight of expectation, leaving no room for doubt about the importance of the event. Margaret nodded stiffly, her fingers fidgeting with a stack of coloring books. "Everything is ready," she replied, her voice tight. Dominic gave her a brief, meaningful glance before moving toward the entrance to greet the families arriving outside. Near the entrance, Chloe Johnson clutched a flyer identical to her father's, her fingers curling tightly around its edges. Her friend Jasmine Lee appeared beside her, wrapping her in a quick, encouraging hug. "You're going to do great," Jasmine said, her tone bright and confident. Chloe managed a small smile and took a deep breath. She squared her shoulders, standing taller. Behind her, Dominic placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. The simple gesture bolstered Chloe's courage, and together they stepped through the doorway, leading the way for the rest of the community. The assembled crowd followed them inside, their footsteps echoing softly against the hardwood floors. The toy store hummed with quiet anticipation, a mixture of whispered conversations and the rustling of coats as families made themselves comfortable. The reading circle was the centerpiece of the store, with bright cushions arranged neatly on the floor. Volunteers took turns reading from colorful picture books, their animated voices capturing the attention of small groups of children seated in cozy clusters. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting warm patches of light across the families gathered inside. Margaret stood near the back wall, her silk blouse smoothing under her nervous fingers. Her gaze kept drifting toward Chloe and Sophie, who sat together on a plush mat near the front. The two girls leaned close, their heads bent together as they whispered about the story being read, a tale of two unlikely friends who learned to overcome their fears together. Chloe pointed to an illustration in the book, and Sophie nodded, her usually reserved face breaking into a genuine smile. The rabbit and the fox discovered that friendship was stronger than any difference between them, the volunteer read, her voice ringing out clearly. Children clutched small stuffed animals from the store's shelves, their expressions captivated by the story's message. When the story concluded, Dominic stepped forward, his measured steps drawing the room's attention. His presence commanded respect, and the gentle murmur of conversation quieted as he cleared his throat. "I want to thank everyone for being here today," Dominic began, his voice carrying clearly. "This event wouldn't be possible without the generosity of our host, Mrs. Whitaker, who has opened her store to the community." All eyes turned to Margaret, who stood frozen under the weight of their gazes. Parents nodded politely, while children looked at her with curiosity. Dominic's gaze remained steady, his expression both challenging and encouraging. It was a silent reminder that today was her chance to rewrite the narrative, to turn a moment of shame into an opportunity for redemption. "We're here today," Dominic continued, "not just to share stories and toys, but to strengthen the bonds that make our neighborhood special. When we open our doors to each other, we open our hearts as well." Margaret shifted her weight uneasily, acutely aware of how Dominic's words illuminated her past failings. The fraudulent ledgers in her office loomed in her mind, their weight pressing against her like a physical burden. As Dominic finished speaking, Angela Foster emerged from the back room, pushing a cart laden with carefully wrapped packages. "Who's ready for a special surprise?" Angela asked cheerfully, her voice breaking the tension. Children's eyes lit up as they lined up eagerly, their excitement contagious. Margaret moved behind the counter, her heels clicking against the floor as she lifted the first package. The small boy who approached first wore glasses too big for his face, and his shy smile revealed a missing tooth. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker," he said softly, accepting the gift with both hands. Margaret froze, her carefully constructed smile faltering. The boy's genuine gratitude pierced through her defenses, and something cracked within her. She remembered why she had opened the store in the first place, not for profit or prestige, but for moments like this. The laughter of children echoed through the store, filling it with a warmth that had been absent for too long. The sunlight streaming through the toy store's windows softened as the day unfolded, but the warmth inside continued to grow. The reading circle shifted to new stories, with children settling into their cushions as another volunteer took up a book. Chloe Johnson and Sophie Whitaker remained at the front, their laughter mingling with the excited chatter of the other children. Margaret Whitaker handed out more packages, each one bringing a fleeting moment of connection with the children she had once viewed with suspicion. Her fingers trembled as she gave a young girl a box wrapped in shimmering paper. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker," the girl said, her eyes wide with wonder. "You're welcome," Margaret replied, her voice quieter than usual. The simplicity of the exchange felt profound, a reminder of how far she had drifted from the purpose of her store. As the children dispersed to other activities, Margaret stepped away from the counter, retreating to the back of the store. She leaned against a wall, her chest tight as she fought the rising wave of emotion. Her polished image, once so impenetrable, now felt like a fragile facade on the verge of shattering. Sophie found her there, standing silently at her mother's side. She didn't speak, instead slipping her hand into Margaret's and giving it a gentle squeeze. The simple gesture grounded Margaret, offering a flicker of strength she desperately needed. "Thank you, Sophie," Margaret murmured, her voice barely audible. "For what?" Sophie asked, tilting her head in confusion. "For reminding me what's important," Margaret replied, her gaze distant. Near the storytelling corner, Dominic Johnson noticed Margaret's retreat. His sharp eyes caught the way her hands trembled as she adjusted her blouse, and the hesitation in her movements as she walked back toward the crowd. He stepped forward, meeting her halfway. "Mrs. Whitaker," Dominic said evenly, his voice low enough not to carry beyond their conversation. "Would you be willing to share a story with the children?" Margaret froze, her heart pounding. "I'm not sure that's a good idea," she said, her voice faltering. "I think it's exactly what's needed," Dominic countered, his tone firm but kind. Margaret glanced toward the reading circle, where the children waited expectantly. Her eyes met Chloe's, and for a moment the weight of her past actions threatened to overwhelm her. But Chloe's expression held no judgment, only quiet encouragement. Taking a deep breath, Margaret stepped forward. She picked up a storybook from the table, its brightly colored cover depicting a forest filled with animals. Margaret settled into the plush armchair at the front of the reading area. The children gathered closer, their curious eyes fixed on her. She opened the book and began to read, her voice tentative at first, but growing steadier with each word. "The brave little truth-teller," she read aloud, "was a rabbit who made a mistake and hid it from his friends in the forest." As the story unfolded, Margaret's voice softened, her cadence mirroring the rabbit's journey from fear to courage. She reached the pivotal moment in the story where the rabbit confessed his mistake, and her throat tightened. I was wrong," she read, her voice cracking. "And I'm sorry for not telling the truth." The words hit her like a thunderclap, the parallels to her own life unmistakable. A tear slipped down her cheek, glinting in the soft afternoon light. She paused, her gaze drifting to Chloe and Sophie. Their presence grounded her, and she found the strength to continue. When she finished the story, the children clapped enthusiastically. Margaret looked up, her eyes meeting Dominic's. His expression was unreadable, but a flicker of approval passed through his gaze. The applause faded, leaving a charged silence in its wake. Margaret stood, the storybook still clutched in her hands. The weight of her secrets pressed down on her, demanding release. She drew a shaky breath and turned to face the crowd. "I need to tell you all something," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. The parents and children leaned in, their curiosity piqued. Chloe and Sophie exchanged a glance, sensing the importance of the moment. "I've made mistakes," Margaret continued, her voice gaining strength. "Terrible mistakes that have hurt people. I let fear and prejudice guide my actions, and I wrongfully accused someone of something they didn't do." Her eyes found Chloe in the crowd. "Chloe, I treated you unfairly. I humiliated you publicly and caused you pain that no child should ever experience. For that, I am deeply sorry." A ripple of surprise passed through the room. Parents exchanged glances, some nodding in quiet approval. Chloe's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't look away. Margaret hesitated, then pressed on. "But that's not all," she admitted. "I haven't been honest in my business dealings. I let greed cloud my judgment, manipulating numbers and betraying the trust of this community." The admission hung in the air, heavy with consequence. Dominic stepped forward, standing beside her. "Acknowledging the truth is never easy," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But it's the first step toward making things right." Margaret turned back to Chloe, tears streaming down her face. "Can you forgive me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Chloe stood slowly, her small frame steady and resolute. She walked toward Margaret, her steps deliberate. "Thank you for saying sorry," Chloe said simply, her voice filled with warmth. "I forgive you." The room seemed to exhale all at once. Margaret's shoulders sagged with relief as Chloe embraced her. The walls she had built around herself crumbled, replaced by a sense of connection she hadn't felt in years. As the event wound down, Margaret moved through the store with a lighter step. She handed out the last of the toys, her interactions with the children genuine and unguarded. Parents approached her, offering kind words and tentative smiles. Dominic watched from the sidelines, his heart full. He saw the beginnings of transformation, not just in Margaret, but in the community as a whole. Sophie approached her mother, slipping her hand into Margaret's. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said softly. Margaret knelt to meet her daughter's eyes, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Sophie. I couldn't have done this without you." Across the room, Chloe and Dominic prepared to leave. Chloe paused at the door, glancing back at Margaret and Sophie. A small smile played on her lips. "It's a good start," she said to her father. Dominic nodded. "It is. And we'll keep building from here." In the weeks that followed, the toy store transformed into a hub of activity and community spirit. The heavy tension that once lingered in the air had been replaced by an atmosphere of warmth and welcome. Bright posters adorned the windows, advertising free storytelling sessions, craft workshops, and community toy swaps. Margaret Whitaker worked tirelessly to fulfill the promises she had made during her confession. With Dominic Johnson's guidance, she had hired an independent accountant to review her finances and oversee the restitution process. The ledgers she once guarded so fiercely were now open, a symbolic step toward accountability and trust. Sophie Whitaker often joined her mother after school, helping arrange books and restock the shelves. She seemed lighter now, more open and confident, as though the weight of unspoken tension had been lifted from her young shoulders. One sunny afternoon, a group of children from the Sunshine Shelter arrived at the store for a special storytelling event. Margaret greeted each child personally, kneeling to their level and offering warm smiles that were no longer forced. She handed out colorful name tags, her once trembling fingers now steady with purpose. Dominic stood nearby, watching as parents and volunteers filled the space. Angela Foster approached him, her face glowing with pride. "This is exactly what we hoped for," Angela said, gesturing toward the happy children. "Margaret is really stepping up." Dominic nodded. "She's proving that change is possible. It's a process, but she's committed." As the storytelling session began, Margaret took her place at the front of the room, a brightly illustrated book in hand. The children sat cross-legged on cushions, their eyes wide with anticipation. "This story," Margaret began, her voice calm and clear, "is about a little girl who finds her way back to happiness after losing it for a while." Behind the scenes, Dominic and Margaret worked together to plan the store's future. They held regular meetings at the community center, often joined by Angela Foster and Rafael Mendoza. The discussions ranged from practical matters like inventory and budgeting to creative ideas for community events. During one such meeting, Rafael spread out a large calendar on the table. "I think we should plan a monthly cultural exchange day," he suggested. "Each month, we can highlight a different culture through stories, crafts, and food." Angela clapped her hands together. "I love that idea. It'll teach the children about the world while bringing families closer." Margaret, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. "We could also partner with local artists and storytellers to make the events even more special." Dominic nodded approvingly. "Let's make it happen." Chloe Johnson and Sophie Whitaker had become inseparable. The two girls spent countless afternoons together, often in the toy store's cozy reading corner. They shared stories, laughter, and dreams for the future, their bond deepened by their shared experiences. One afternoon, as they sat cross-legged on the floor, Chloe pulled out a small notebook filled with her sketches. She opened to a page that featured a detailed drawing of the toy store, surrounded by children of all ages and backgrounds. "This is how I see the store now," Chloe said, her voice soft but proud. "A place where everyone feels welcome." Sophie traced a finger over the drawing, her expression thoughtful. "It's beautiful," she said. "I want to help make it like this." "You already are," Chloe replied, smiling warmly. The holiday season brought new opportunities for Margaret to demonstrate her commitment to the community. She organized a toy drive, encouraging families to donate gently used toys for children in need. The response was overwhelming, with donations pouring in from every corner of the neighborhood. On the day of the toy distribution, Margaret stood by a large donation box, her hands steady as she handed out gifts. Parents offered kind words and smiles, while children beamed with excitement. One little girl, clutching a stuffed bear with a bright red bow, looked up at Margaret and said, "Thank you for the best Christmas ever." Margaret's eyes filled with tears, and she knelt to embrace the child. "You're very welcome," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Across the room, Dominic watched the scene unfold. He felt a sense of pride, not only in Margaret's progress, but in the community's willingness to embrace forgiveness and growth. As the year drew to a close, the toy store hosted its final event of the season, a New Year's celebration focused on gratitude and new beginnings. Families gathered in the store, sharing stories of hope and resilience while children played and crafted. Margaret stood at the front of the room, addressing the crowd with a newfound confidence. "This year has been a journey," she began. "A journey of facing hard truths and learning how to make things right. I couldn't have done it without all of you, your support, your forgiveness, and your belief in second chances." The crowd erupted into applause, their warmth enveloping Margaret like a soft blanket. She glanced toward Sophie, who stood beside Chloe, both girls clapping enthusiastically. Dominic stepped forward, joining Margaret at the front. "This store has become more than just a place to buy toys," he said. "It's a symbol of what we can achieve when we come together as a community." Later that evening, in the quiet of the Johnson home, Chloe sat at the kitchen table, a notebook open before her. The pages were filled with her neat handwriting, each word carefully chosen to capture the story she wanted to tell. Dominic entered the room, carrying 2 steaming mugs of cocoa. He set one down in front of Chloe and ruffled her hair affectionately. "What are you working on, sweetheart?" he asked. Chloe looked up, her eyes sparkling. "I'm writing a story about everything that's happened, about Mrs. Whitaker and Sophie and the store. I want people to know that change is possible." Dominic smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's a story worth telling," he said. The morning after the New Year's celebration, Margaret and Sophie arrived at the store early to begin preparations for the upcoming month's events. The schedule was packed with activities, from puppet shows to science-themed craft days. Sophie helped arrange a new display of books, carefully organizing them by theme. She paused to admire a large poster featuring a photo of the store's community day, with Margaret and Dominic standing side by side, surrounded by smiling children. "Look at how much has changed," Sophie said softly, glancing at her mother. Margaret smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "And it's only the beginning." A few days later, Chloe and Dominic walked past the store on their way to the park. Chloe paused to admire the window display, which now featured handmade crafts from local children. A sign announced the store's new motto, "Where every child belongs." Dominic placed a hand on Chloe's shoulder, his voice filled with pride. "You've been a big part of this change, sweetheart." Chloe looked up at him, her eyes shining. "So have you, Dad." They continued down the sidewalk, the sun shining brightly overhead. The toy store behind them stood as a beacon of growth, forgiveness, and hope, a testament to what a community could achieve when it worked together. One chilly afternoon, as the first hints of winter painted the sky a soft gray, Chloe Johnson knocked on the Whitakers' front door. Sophie answered almost immediately, her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the house. "Come in," Sophie said, smiling as she stepped aside to let Chloe enter. The two girls quickly settled in Sophie's bedroom, which was surprisingly cozy despite the grandness of the house. The room was filled with bookshelves and a small writing desk where Sophie had arranged her favorite fairy tales. Chloe ran her fingers over the spines of the books. "You really like stories," she said, her voice tinged with admiration. Sophie nodded. "They make me feel like anything is possible, even when things are hard." Chloe paused, then said quietly, "Do you ever think about what happened? At the store, I mean?" Sophie glanced at the floor, her expression thoughtful. "All the time," she admitted. "It used to feel like a really bad dream. But now, I think maybe it happened for a reason. It's like—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's like it woke my mom up. She's trying so hard now." Chloe smiled softly. "She is, and I'm glad. I never thought I'd feel okay going back to that store, but it's different now. It feels safe." The two girls exchanged a look of understanding, their friendship deepening in the shared acknowledgement of how far things had come. They spent the afternoon reading and drawing together, their laughter filling the room like the sweetest music. Meanwhile, Dominic Johnson sat in the community center with Rafael Mendoza, Angela Foster, and several other volunteers. The group was finalizing plans for a new mentorship program aimed at pairing teenagers with younger children to foster connection and support. "We could hold the sessions at the toy store," Rafael suggested, spreading a map of the neighborhood across the table. "It's become such a central space for everyone." Angela nodded enthusiastically. "And we could integrate some of the cultural exchange themes we've been working on. Imagine kids sharing stories from their heritage while learning from older mentors." Dominic leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's exactly the kind of initiative we need," he said. "It's not just about the kids, though. It's about the whole community coming together." The group spent hours refining the plan, their excitement growing with each new idea. By the time they left, the winter sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the streets. The toy store stood in the distance, its windows glowing warmly against the encroaching cold. Back at the store, Margaret was busy preparing for the next day's events. She worked late into the evening, organizing craft supplies and restocking shelves. Her movements were deliberate, almost meditative, as she placed tiny chairs in the storytelling corner and arranged books by theme. For Margaret, these small tasks had taken on a new meaning. They were no longer about maintaining a perfect image or increasing profits. They were acts of care, gestures meant to welcome the community she had once held at arm's length. Sophie appeared in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs of tea. "I thought you might need a break," she said, setting one mug on the counter beside her mother. Margaret smiled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you, sweetheart. I think I did." They sat together in the quiet store, sipping their tea and watching the snow begin to fall outside. Sophie rested her head on Margaret's shoulder, and for the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a sense of peace. The first snowfall of the season coincided with a highly anticipated event at the toy store. Winter Tales and Traditions, a day dedicated to sharing seasonal stories from around the world. The store had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with twinkling lights draped across the shelves and paper snowflakes hanging from the ceiling.